you could immediately decide within, I'd say, an hour that person A was someone that actually could be someone for this organization. Person B, you wanted to get rid of them as quickly as possible.
Hello and welcome to another episode of The Gift Show.
But you have to prioritize what are the basic 4 or 5 things I have to pay for every month.
The theme for season 9 is money matters.
Maybe even looking at, do I have 2 cars? Do I go down to 1? Could I possibly even cycle to work? Could I use public transport and leave the car at home?
My guest today is Donal Keating.
If you cannot cope with change, then you probably shouldn't be in the job in the first instance, because
by way of introduction, Donal retired from Dublin Bus in 2020 from the role of Operations Director. Did you find it was very important to be able to cope with change and roll with the punches over the years?
Absolutely. I think it's something that if you cannot cope with change, then you probably shouldn't be in the job in the first instance, because effectively, I think you have to expect change as part of what goes on in any kind of environment. And in the 40 years that I was with Dublin Bus, there was tremendous change. I probably come from a time when buses broke down on a regular basis. They were very much, they are still fueled by diesel, but we are heading into the electric age now, and we hope to have, Dublin Bus, I should say, hope to have about 100 electric buses before the end of this year, I think. But the shape of the bus, the amount of information we give the customer, what the customer expects from us, the amount of bus priority that's on the street, all of those things have changed dramatically. And I think as well, we obviously think more about the customer now from the perspective of not just the actual physical bus journey itself, but from the time they leave their house to the time they actually get to their destination, and all of the things in between. What are all the aspects of all of that journey that we can influence, that we can help, that we can assist? And I think in particular over the last 3 or 4 years, the amount of money that's available now for public transport is bringing it absolutely into the next century, as it were, and giving a much better product to the customer. So it's been a lot of change, and you have to be able to work with that change. Otherwise, everything gets very static.
So what advice would you have for a person who's entering, a new profession, or they're a mid-career person who wants to progress from mid-level to more senior level? Do you think getting involved in projects is a great idea for people to make progress within an organization?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I suppose the most fundamental thing I'd say to anybody, whatever realm of life they're in terms of work, is you have to be willing to work hard. And I think it also helps greatly, and this doesn't always happen for people, if you have a bit of a passion for what you're doing. I mean, I would not have necessarily known before I started to work with Dublin Bus that I would have a passion for transport. But over the first, I suppose, 5 years working with Dublin Bus, I really became part of the kind of family, and I really cared about what actually happened in Dublin Bus. And as you said, then talking about projects, I think it always helps if you're involved in a project that has a start, middle, and end, because you learn so much from projects. And one of the things you learn is that you make mistakes. And I think you have to be willing to make mistakes, because I think Einstein is one of the people quoted for saying that someone who's never made a mistake hasn't actually done anything. So effectively, you really do need to have a passion for it, need to work exceptionally hard. Einstein again talked about 99% perspiration or perseverance and 1% intellect, if you like. So you really have to go out there and work exceptionally hard. But if you're willing to do that, I think the gains are absolutely there. One of the things that struck me, and I'm not sure if this is really answering your point, but sometimes if you had a temporary person join us for the summer, you could immediately decide within, I'd say, an hour, whether that temporary individual, the temporary work that individual was doing, that person was going to be good or bad. The good person, you told them what you wanted them to do. They did it and came back to you, having done it right, and said, "Can I have more, please?" The person who wasn't going to be successful didn't get it right the first time, didn't listen properly, and probably when they finished, didn't tell you they'd finished and came back to you 3 hours later. And you immediately knew that person A was someone that actually could be someone for this organization. Person B, you wanted to get rid of them as quickly as possible. So that ability to have a good work ethic, that ability to have some passion, that ability to work hard, they're all the things that are hugely important, no matter what the work is, no matter what level you're at in that work. If you have those ethics going in, I think you will succeed.
Going back to your early days as a graduate engineer in CIE Group, Donal, if you can remember back to the 1980s, CIE, like everything else in Ireland at the time, was starved of cash.
Yes.
And investment was, pretty thin in the ground. The buses were breaking down everywhere on the Dublin streets and country roads, of course, with bus air at the time.
Yes.
What advice would you have to the person who's struggling with the cost of living crisis at the moment, who's trying to juggle many different priorities, but their money is scarce enough where they're having to make things stretch, I suppose you could say?
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult. And it's funny when you talk about the 80s, and I always get mixed up whether this was the late 80s or early 90s. But, I do remember a time where interest rates, I think, were up to something like 11, 12, 13%, which even now, and the cost of living and interest rates have gone up a lot in the last year and a half. But they're still not at anything like that level. And it is a very difficult situation for people because, particularly if you've started a young family, and you need to have X amount of money coming in every week, stroke every month to pay the bills, to pay the mortgage, to pay everything. But so, what advice? I mean, I suppose my advice would be, you absolutely have to prioritize. It sounds very simple in a way, but you have to prioritize what are the basic 4 or 5 things I have to pay for every month, and unfortunately lose some of the things that are the things you enjoy. So whether that's your cup of coffee every day, which everyone deserves to give themselves a little bit of reward. I'm going off subject slightly, but I do think something I learned in life is that you do need to reward yourself a little bit as well as you go along, and not be too hard on yourself all the time. Because I think if it's all work and no play, then I think you do get to a burnout situation. So you need to have a little bit of that as well going on. But if you're in this really difficult financial situation that you kind of paint there, that picture, then you definitely have to prioritize. You have to decide what are the 4 or 5 most important things I've got to do, and budget accordingly. And hopefully things will change again. I mean, we've all experienced, John, I think you and I particularly over the years, that cyclical nature of things. And one of the things, just going back to again something we spoke about earlier with public transport, because of the investment in public transport over the last few years with the NTA, public transport is a lot cheaper now than it was. And it is a possible alternative. And with climate change, sustainability, and all of those things being very, very, very important as we go forward in the century, maybe even looking at, do I have 2 cars? Do I go down to 1? Could I possibly even cycle to work? Could I use public transport and leave the car at home, and only put petrol in every 2 months, every 2 weeks or whatever? There's a whole lot of things. We've all been there. As I said, we've all had those cycles through our lives, and that doesn't make it any easier for the people who are going through it now. But there are ways around it, but you do have to be clever.
Do you recommend that people who are, from an engineering or scientific background, they should do an MBA if they want to get into management positions?
Yes, I would absolutely say that it's a very, very useful degree or master's to have. In my situation, I was lucky in that Dublin Bus actually sent me on two masters. So I'll very briefly talk about the transportation one, which happened within the early part of my career. So within the first couple of years, I suppose the way Dublin Bus thought about it was you're coming in as an engineer with all the logic that entails, if you like, but you don't know an awful lot about transport. So I was sent to Newcastle upon Tyne, and spent a year over there and did a master's in transportation. And what I found most useful about that was when you were talking to your peers, particularly in outside agencies like the local authorities and so on and so forth, it gave you the extra knowledge you needed to have so that you could talk to them at their level, as it were, because they had some expertise in transportation which perhaps you didn't have. So that degree was very useful in that context. And then about halfway through my career, Dublin Bus felt that there should be greater learning going on within the organisation, and people that they were, I suppose, not necessarily that they'd earmarked for future growth, but people that were showing potential, shall we say. An opportunity came up for a number of us to do a master's in business administration. And what I found really, really useful about that was, yes, it gave you a much better context of business and all of the things around business, but you learn nearly as much from the people that you're doing the course with as you learn from the course itself. And because it was halfway through my career, I was in the kind of funny position that I think myself and one other guy were actually in our 40s, but all of the rest of the class were in their late 20s, maybe just touching 30. And that of itself provided a huge experience for me, because I could see the different ways, if you like, that the younger people were bringing things up and were making presentations and using perhaps some software and things like that I wouldn't have been as familiar with, perhaps I should have been. But then I could see from the older guy, the older guy in the class around my vintage was one of the best presenters I'd ever come across. He could tell a story with pictures. And as you know, in the MBA, you do projects all the time. And I was lucky enough at times to be on his project group, and other times to be just listening to the results of their project group work. And the learning you pick up, the ways that ideas are expressed were just fantastic. So I very much welcome that opportunity because it just gave me a better oversight and definitely helped set me up for that senior management position that I then got later on in my career. Correct.
It's been a great conversation today, Donal. So I'd like to thank you for your time, because you've given the audience great value. Thank you, Donal.
Thank you very much, John.